One recent survey found that 70% of Americans now believe in climate change, and 57% believe it's caused by humans. Then leave their 5,000 square foot mansion in a 6,000 pound Escalade, drive to the airport, fly to Las Vegas, order a 16-ounce steak, rent a jet ski, drive a Lamborghini, and buy a flamethrower. Okay, that may be slightly exaggerated, but it's clear that worldwide most countries aren't doing enough to achieve the Paris Climate Accord's goal of limiting global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius. Over 97% of climate scientists believe in human-caused climate change. However, only 16% of Americans are even aware that the consensus is over 90%, and the consensus is overwhelming. In fact, one study found that there's only a 1 in 1 million chance that we are not responsible for climate change. To be clear, climate change is not going to cause the apocalypse, but it is absolutely within our best long-term economic interest to act sooner rather than later. Experts predict a mere 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature could lead to a gross world product loss of 10% by the end of the century and bring a 20% likelihood of causing a catastrophic economic impact defined as a global GDP loss of 25% or more. With that in mind, why do people who fully accept the science behind climate change still test their new flamethrowers standing on top of their Hummer in the driveway of their California mansion? Well, because climate change is a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons. It is within our collective best interest to reduce our carbon emissions as a planet. There's no question about that. However, let's be honest, you are personally not going to make a difference. The carbon you emit is absolutely inconsequential to the entire planet's warming. Given the massive personal benefits of using fossil fuels, it's in your best interest to emit as much carbon as you want. It's the same story for companies and countries. Even if there is some sort of agreement, there's still an incentive to cheat and become a free rider while everybody else does the work, since the benefits are universal. This leads to what is known as a market failure in economics. Free markets are generally the best way to efficiently allocate resources and encourage innovation. People and businesses make rational decisions about how to make and spend money, which leads to increased prosperity. However, as we've established, people don't really factor the environmental cost of emitting carbon into their decisions. Pollution is a textbook negative externality. People who emit carbon dioxide impose a cost on society through natural disasters, rising sea levels, heat waves, and health consequences that they don't pay, which leads to an overconsumption of carbon dioxide emitting goods compared to what would be optimal. The solution to this is a per unit carbon tax equal to the societal damage caused by emitting a ton of carbon to align the true cost of carbon to the price the emitter pays. This will internalize the cost of polluting and make the market more efficient. Economic actors will be incentivized to reduce the use of carbon-emitting activities or to find low-carbon substitutes. To put it simply, if you make emitting carbon more expensive, people will emit less of it. The best way to implement carbon taxes is as far upstream as possible by taxing the company where the fossil fuels enter the market. This would be very simple and bureaucratically lean. Carbon taxes have overwhelming support among economists, possibly even nearing the consensus among climate scientists that climate change is happening in the first place. One of the biggest misconceptions about carbon taxes is that the point is to raise money for green energy subsidies. Much of the debate regarding carbon taxes is about if the government can be trusted to do what they say they're going to do with the money. One of the reasons for the Yellow Vest movement in France, among other things, was the fear that the government would not spend the revenue on an ecological transition. However, this completely misses the point. The point of a carbon tax is for a market correction by making polluting more expensive, therefore reducing demand for carbon-intensive products and increasing demand for low-carbon alternatives. The government could literally throw the money in a black hole and the taxes would still be effective. In fact, studies have shown that subsidies targeted at green energy are far less effective than a properly corrected market. A lot of people on the internet wrongly blame capitalism for global warming. What's to blame is a market that doesn't properly price carbon emissions. In a properly priced market, the innovation, efficiency, competition, and thirst for profit that drive capitalism are aligned with reducing emissions. Now, does that mean the government shouldn't do anything else? Not necessarily. Investing in innovation of green technology such as carbon capture devices can have benefits for everyone, but in general, carbon taxes beat targeted subsidies. Okay, that makes sense and all, but you hate poor people. Alright, maybe throwing the money in a black hole would hurt poor people. However, the genius idea to get around this is a carbon dividend. What this means is all the revenue from carbon taxes is equally distributed back to every person. Because private jet setting, Ferrari driving, super yacht owning billionaires emit more carbon, and in general carbon emissions correlate with income, carbon dividends will be progressive. Everyone gets back the same check, but anyone emitting less carbon than average will get more money than they pay in, which is almost every poor household, and actually 60 to 70% of all Americans. In other words, a carbon dividend plan would actually help poor people. Furthermore, such a plan is revenue neutral, which will not increase the size of government or cause debates about the proper size of government. Now you may be thinking, what's the point of this if I get everything back? Well, if you're an average carbon emitter, you could not change anything and be financially just as well off as you are now. But since the check's the same for everyone, you will get free money if you choose to lower your carbon emissions. Okay, maybe this will reduce the number of recreational flamethrowers, but for all intents and purposes, I have to drive to work tomorrow. How is this supposed to reduce emissions when people don't have a choice? Well, in the short term, the demand for some activities is very inelastic. The demand for gas is by no means perfectly inelastic. Some people may move, get a more fuel-efficient car, or not fly somewhere far away. Gas cars are probably going to be around for a while, but many other sources of emissions are much more responsive to price changes. However, what's more important than encouraging people to make minor changes in consumption habits is creating demand for lower carbon alternatives. The point is to create demand for things like better electric cars and clean power. The alternatives might just not exist yet because there isn't enough demand. Pricing carbon emissions correctly will stop giving high carbon products an unfair advantage and will allow reasonable alternatives to exist. With that being said, how high should a carbon tax be? Well, theoretically, it should be equal to the damage done to society. However, that's something that's going to be extremely hard to quantify and depends greatly on how much you value money now instead of the future. Depending on the discount rate and assumptions made, the social cost of carbon can be approximately $40 to $400 per ton. Instead, we could choose a goal and calculate the needed carbon tax to achieve that goal. For a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, we would need a per ton carbon tax of about $136. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would need a carbon tax of about $236 per ton. For reference, a ton of carbon dioxide is produced by about 110 gallons of gas, which means a $100 carbon tax will lead to just under $1 more per gallon of gas. Okay, but doesn't that just mean companies can buy the right to pollute? Yes, and that's the point, compared to right now where companies can just pollute as much as they want. And it's important to note that while we should definitely start making some significant cuts to our carbon emissions right now, the point is not to stop emitting carbon tomorrow. That would lead to an actual apocalypse. Some high carbon products are worth it to our society and we will be willing to pay dearly for them. However, if the company can use a much lower carbon alternative at a slightly higher cost, the point is to incentivize them to do so. Okay, but won't companies just move production to countries without a carbon tax? Well, this can be fixed with border adjustments. Basically, if a product enters a country from another country without a carbon tax, the amount of carbon needed to produce it can be estimated and taxed upon entering the country. This would encourage other countries to implement their own carbon taxes since they would be missing out on revenue getting collected by another country anyway. Ideally, once one major country like the US creates a carbon tax, other major world powers would follow, and the border issue wouldn't be as big of a deal. Preferably, carbon pricing can be a bipartisan solution to climate change. If you're a liberal, you should support a revenue-neutral carbon tax because liberals usually list climate change as a top issue that will affect the world's disadvantaged the most, and this is probably the best tool we have at fighting climate change. Additionally, the dividend will help poor people and make the rich pay for any unnecessary carbon they emit. And finally, you know that a plan has to be politically feasible in the first place, and conservatives are much more likely to support a market-based solution than a laundry list of command and control regulations. On the flip side, if you're a conservative, you should fully support a carbon dividend system. We have to do something about climate change, and a market-based solution that harnesses the power of capitalism is more effective and vastly more preferable to a bureaucratic and inefficient network of regulations. Unless you're a literal anarchist, you probably support some form of taxation, like an income tax, and income is something we generally want more of. Is it really that big a leap to want to tax something we want less of? A revenue-neutral plan wouldn't increase the size of government and would be extremely easy to implement. You're still free to do whatever you want as long as you pay the true social cost. Not acting on climate change would lead to increased natural disasters and problems that would increase taxes and reduce freedoms in the future. Okay then, is solving climate change really as simple as a carbon tax? Well, sort of maybe. Make no mistake, carbon taxes are probably the best policy tool we have to combat climate change, and some studies even argue that we literally won't stop using fossil fuels without a carbon tax. The problem is that while surveys do indicate that the majority of people from both major parties, all states, and all congressional districts support requiring fossil fuel companies to pay a carbon tax, attempts to implement or raise a carbon tax in places like Washington State, Canada, and France have nonetheless faced some bitter opposition. This opposition is in response to a carbon tax not anywhere near what the true social cost is. It's not out of the question that a carbon tax could be passed, but it's also unlikely, in my opinion, that it would be anywhere near high enough to actually be the solution to climate change. And the truth is, while most people say they care about the environment and are probably willing to support some mostly symbolic policies, when it comes down to it, one survey found that only 57% of people are even willing to pay a mere $1 per month, and 23% are willing to pay $40 per month to combat climate change. Both of these numbers are grossly under what the true social cost of carbon is, and also why a revenue-neutral system is important if we want any chance of getting the price high enough. Still, due to political resistance, it may be necessary to use more popular and easier to understand but less economically efficient policies to combat climate change. Even with a proper carbon tax, there are still concerns that other policies may be warranted. The real world is complicated and there may be other subtler market failures that require different solutions. And as mentioned earlier, research and innovation of green energy is a good idea to reduce carbon emissions regardless of a carbon tax. Still, a carbon tax to correct the textbook market failure of pollution has overwhelming support among economists. Recently, over 3,500 economists, including dozens of Nobel Prize winners and all 4 former Federal Reserve chairs, have signed the Climate Leadership Council's statement on carbon dividends. There is no doubt that a properly implemented carbon tax is the single best policy tool we have and common sense bipartisan start to addressing one of the biggest issues we will face in the 21st century. Thank you for watching.